to the Prince George's County Memorial Library Systems program, A Conversation with David M. Kennedy. I served as the librarian at the Prince George's County Correctional Center for 9 years, and now I oversee and coordinate system-wide programming, services, and initiatives for adults and seniors. One of our goals in programming for PGC-MLS is to highlight important work, including social justice initiatives which might benefit the Prince George's County community. Today, I'm honored to facilitate a discussion with David M. Kennedy, the developer of the Focused Deterrence Homicide Prevention approach. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to type them into the chat. We'll start with remarks from PGC-MLS's new Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Mark Winston, who will be featured in a community conversation co-hosted by the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights on May 23rd, 2024 at 4 p.m. Dr. Winston will then introduce Representative Glenn Ivey, who will then introduce our guest, David M. Kennedy. So let's get started. Please welcome Dr. Mark Winston.
Good afternoon, everyone. As CEO of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, I'm very pleased to make a few brief remarks as we host today's program. I've known David Kennedy and of his work as the preeminent expert on the deterrence of violence in communities for years. He's a researcher, consultant, and thought leader on a topic that touches all communities. And I'm particularly enthusiastic about his leading a discussion around this timely and important topic with the library system as host. I won't delay our getting started, as the official introduction of our guest will be provided by U.S. Representative Glenn Ivey. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Congressman Glenn Ivey. Violence is a plague in our community and throughout the United States. During my time as state's attorney in Prince George's County from 2002 to 2010, I worked diligently to prevent gun violence, intervene with troubled youth, and prosecute violent offenders. We even instituted our own version of the Boston strategy, developed in large part by today's speaker, David Kennedy. His groundbreaking work was key to reducing gun crimes in Boston, North Carolina, and jurisdictions across the country beginning in the 1990s. Using data-driven approaches has always been David's hallmark. His research is informed by everyday people in the community, the folks who can't use their playgrounds because of violent drug dealing, the folks who were too afraid to sit on their porches and stoops, the old, tired gang members who no longer want to be part of the problem. David has listened to them all and developed policy recommendations based on those experiences. Keeping our community safe is Professor David Kennedy's true calling. His efforts have led to dramatic declines in gun crimes in major metropolitan areas across the country. It worked here in Prince George's County. It can work again in other communities too. So please give a warm welcome to our special guest from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Professor David M. Kennedy.
Hi, David. How are you doing today?
Very well, Audrey. You?
It's great to be here with you. I'm really excited. I promise I will not get too excited while talking about this book, which I really enjoyed. But let's just start with the big question, which I'm sure those of you who haven't read or had a chance to read David's book, Don't Shoot, One Man, A Street Fellowship and the End of Violence in Inner City America. Could you talk a little bit, David, about the focused deterrence intervention framework? How did it come about? And what is the state of the art today?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Dr. Winston for putting this all together. And I guess I can thank Congressman Ivey's avatar, if nothing else. We have a saying at the National Network for Safe Communities, which I am of which I am the faculty chair at John Jay College here in New York City, which is that we like to work with people who like to work, and it's always not only a pleasure but a gift to find people who really care about these issues and want to do something practical. And I will get to what focused deterrence is, but maybe the place to start is what it means. And I care deeply, as my old friend Congressman Ivey said, about safety. The National Network is a group of public safety and violence prevention obsessives, people who care about this, or really, just people who live in the world, know that violence is special. Violence is particularly toxic, particularly damaging. It's different than other kinds of harms, and not to denigrate the importance of other kinds of harms and doing something about them, but we all know in our bones that whether it's a city or a neighborhood or a relationship or a workplace, if there's violence in that setting, if there's fear in that setting, they cannot be right. And we think that being safe and feeling safe is foundational for everything else. And there are now, in the parlance we're all using these days, there are evidence-based approaches to addressing the most serious violence. That is a development of the last several decades, whether it was law enforcement or public health or government or community organizations. There was nothing that any of us knew how to do that would reliably, predictably, in real life, make a big difference in homicide and gun violence quickly and effectively. Now there is. And you are not very far from Philadelphia, you are not very far from Baltimore, you are not very far from Wilmington, Delaware, you are a little bit further from Chester, Pennsylvania, which is where I first met Dr. Winston. Those are all places that have been characterized for a very long time for having very serious, mostly gun violence problems. And they are all places that have determined to do real work on that. And they are all places where things have gotten a lot better because of it. This is now something that serious people can do if they commit themselves to it. Wilmington used to be the most dangerous city in the United States for children, for violence directed at young people. And in the first year that Wilmington committed to this approach, they brought gun violence down over 60%. I'm with you today because Dr. Winston, he was in an equivalent position with the Chester, Pennsylvania library system, committed himself to bringing this work to Chester. They are now doing that and have cut gun violence across the board by close to 70% in the several years since they started. It's real work. It's not easy, but it's not impossible anymore. So that's the main thing. The rest of it, in some ways, is detail, right? If we've got these issues, which we all do, and if there are things that we know work, which now there are, we should just do them, right? If they're legal and moral, and this is legal and moral. But you asked a question, which is what is it? And the part of this portfolio that I've been personally involved with is focused surgically on the most serious violence. It's not about other kinds of crime. It's not about drug markets. It's not about really anything else. It is about creating safety where, for way too many people, as Glenn said, there is fear now. It turns out, as an empirical matter, that homicide and gun violence is driven by very small numbers of very extreme people. We have a saying in my shop that there's no such thing as a dangerous neighborhood. And what we mean by that is that places that people think are dangerous really aren't. Almost everybody in them is at next to no risk for hurting somebody, next to no risk for being hurt. And at the same time, in those places, there's a very small, very active world that is at extreme risk for all of those things. So we call our intervention the group violence intervention. And that's because that small world of extremely high risk is built up of usually small, usually informal, usually neighborhood based groups of extremely active people. They can be people, what people call gangs. They can not look very much like what people think a gang is. They can be little drug crews. They can be families that are intergenerational family networks that very much drive and suffer from this kind of thing. But it is overwhelmingly a group and network problem. And the concentration is so extreme that we now know in the United States, if you look at years worth of homicides and shootings, they will come back to groups, as I've been describing them, that collectively make up about 0.5% of the jurisdiction. So tiny subpopulation. And that 0.5% will be connected with 50, 60, 70, 75% of all the homicides and non-fatal shootings. And what the group violence intervention does is put together a very pragmatic working partnership. It's law enforcement, police, prosecutors, probation, that kind of thing. It's community figures, and it is social service providers. And that partnership starts talking directly to that world of groups. And the messages that they hear are supportive. The goal here, we say, is safe, alive, and free. We want people to be safe. We don't want them hurt, and we don't want them locked up. And this small world is at extreme risk for all of those bad outcomes. And the community partners say to group members, we love you, we care about you. There are some things you have to stop doing because they are wrong and they are tearing your own community apart. And they are hurting people you care about and people who care about you. And this is what scholars call informal social control. And it's far more powerful than the police. So this really makes a big difference. The social service providers say, let us help you any way that we can. And what turns out to be true about the men and young men who are involved in this world is that they are usually living dangerous, chaotic, and not very successful lives. They are soaked in trauma. Their friends and family members have been hurt. They have housing, food, shelter issues. They need all kinds of immediate help. And so we organize to get them stable and help them in any way that we can. Ultimately, aspirationally, school and work. But people have to be safe and stable before they can think seriously about that kind of thing. And law enforcement says, listen to these other folks. We are tired of what we have been doing. We've been locking you up. It hasn't worked. We haven't kept you safe. We need you to be safe. But understand that violence is special to us, and we will be making a special effort going forward to focus our legal responses on the people and the groups that are driving the violence. And we're telling you this ahead of time because we don't want to have to do it. And going forward, you and your group will select themselves for this kind of high-level attention if you hurt people. And that's the intervention. The rest of it is getting it right and finding the right partners and getting all the pieces in place and keeping them together. But this is the kind of thing that when it's done properly and when it's focused on, again, this extraordinarily small world of people at highest risk, can make a tremendous difference very quickly.
I think for me, what's so novel is putting all of these groups in a room together and making that intervention. It's really powerful for those people who have had any contact with anyone who's a justice-involved individual. I guess my question is, how do you inspire people to believe? How do you inspire people to believe the impossible, that this can happen, that their neighbors can be free of violence, that they can feel empowered to be part of the solution? How do you do that?
I've been thinking a lot about the fact that when I first met Dr. Winston, it was in the Chester Public Library system. And this today is being hosted by the PG County Public Library system. And I really like that. And one answer to your question is that if people don't believe this, they should go to your library and they should do their homework, because this is now well documented. It's been written up in all kinds of different ways. There are the impenetrable social science peer-reviewed articles that nobody likes to read. I and others have written about this in ordinary English. There are the how-to guides. There are the testimonials of people like Congressman Ivey who spearheaded this in their own places. The good news now is really the good news that I started out with to your first question. This works, and we're 30 years into the record now of showing over and over and over again that it can work. And for a very long time, there was no really good answer to your question. It was very hard to convince people that sitting down and engaging respectfully and in a lot of ways very positively with the most dangerous people in a city made any sense at all. Thankfully, we're to the point now that institutions like yours have those records. And if you are reality-based, you should take this kind of thing seriously.
I guess before I go on to my next group of questions, I guess, what do these communities look like when you're done? The 70%, the 80% violence cut down. Like, what kind of neighborhood are you walking into to start, and what does it look like when you're done?
So I think the most important thing to say is that they don't look like what they ought to look like. And we should be really, really honest about this. The brunt of violent victimization, gun homicide, fear of gun homicide, and serious violence of the kind we're talking about falls overwhelmingly disproportionately on poor communities of color in the United States. The victimization rate for Black men in this country is about 8 times their representation in the population. And that is not an accident. The rest of the country and history has created the neighborhoods and the communities where this is endemic. Again, I met Dr. Winston in Chester, and Chester at the time was, on a population basis, consistently one of the most violent jurisdictions in the country. It had a homicide rate multiple times that of Chicago. And Chester was an overwhelmingly Black city created by financial and industrial interests in the Delaware Valley. It was created by rich people to maintain a source of essentially captive cheap labor for industry in that area. Chester did not create itself. Chester was created. And like so many of the communities or the parts of communities where what people now call community violence is such an issue, they are poor. They have been created through generations of racism. They have been neglected. They have healthcare and education and economic opportunity issues. They need attention to their built environment. They need supports for families and kids. They need just about everything that you can think of. And stopping the violence doesn't change all of those things. Stopping the violence is, we think, a precondition for being able to work effectively on those things. You can't make people go to school when they're afraid of getting to school. You can't make people start businesses in a community where they know that these issues will keep them from being successful. And honestly, it's very difficult to address our worst conceptions and preconceptions of each other when terrible things keep happening and when the outside world is manifestly ineffective at doing anything about that. So the kind of traditional approach to violence prevention was on one side of the policy aisle anyway, fix all those root causes and the violence will take care of itself. And those root causes need all kinds of attention. But this approach says, do something about the violence right now, which is a good thing in and of itself, and then it makes everything else easier.
So public libraries are one of the last safe third spaces. So one of those places between home and work in American society. When you create your communities of law enforcement, neighborhoods, gang members, and those community groups, you say that something magical happens. Can you help those of us who work and live and engage in libraries visualize a future role in this maybe community commitment to work to end violence? Is that something we can, as a system, do? In your opinion?
Well, my opinion is shaped, for example, by the fact that you're doing it, right? You made this happen, right? This conversation we're having right now. And that's really important. Any kind of work like this needs champions. And I'll just go back once again to the beginning of my deeply valued relationship with Dr. Winston. I went to school at Swarthmore College, which is walking distance from Chester, Pennsylvania. And I really didn't give these issues a second thought while I was a privileged white college student within walking distance of Chester, Pennsylvania. And I will never stop being ashamed about that. And I cannot tell you how many times after I started doing this kind of thing, I went to Chester, I tried to get people in Chester, and by that I mean elected and appointed people, the government and folks close to them, to do something, to want to do something. And I failed over and over and over and over again. And it really wasn't until there was citizen activism and Dr. Winston's leadership in that library was a big part of that. He brought me to Chester years back, and that turned out to be finally the beginning of movement that led to real work finally happening in Chester. And that leadership can come from almost anywhere. But as you said, and I'm going to use different language than you did, but libraries are a really important civic and democratic institution. And they signal community, they signal commitment to education, they're collective. I will tell you personally that they are a haven for people who don't feel like they belong much of anywhere else, especially perhaps while they're young and growing up. I haunted my libraries when I was a kid, and they can exercise this kind of leadership. They can, as you all do, say, we're going to spend some time this year, this summer, this season, focusing on a particular issue. You can organize the readings and the other kinds of art forms that let people understand this kind of thing. In Peoria, I got a call one day, and it was a civic group saying, we are committed to doing violence prevention in our community. We do something called Peoria Reads out of the library system. And we would like to do Peoria Reads this next time. And that's reading groups and convenings and online chats and panels with notables and all that kind of thing. And we're going to organize that around your book, Don't Shoot, which is the very non-academic book that I wrote when I realized nobody read my academic stuff. And they did that. And that was the beginning of bringing this work to Peoria, where it was very successful. There are all kinds of things that libraries can do, and for which I think libraries are in a lot of ways particularly well suited. You know, those kinds of public conversations are the way, you know, a good democracy ought to operate, and you can facilitate that.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people don't know that we have a library in our county correctional center. And one of the things about your book that made me laugh really early on was the fact that you talked about dealers reading newspapers. And I kind of got a little choked up because I said they read books too. And if anyone out there is wondering, it's not just, you know, because they have time. It's because they have interest, and they're just like us. And it's philosophy, it's, you know, sociology, it's history, it's religion. Offenders and drug dealers are often written off. I mean, I would tell people all the time, they read so much, like anything they can get their hands on. But they're often demonized. And the community, leaders, law enforcement, you know, anyone who leaves these neighborhoods, including our own here in Prince George's County, I'm always asked, how can you live in Hyattsville? Well, it's where I live. It's home. And my 10 years after a PhD, I call it my postdoc in prison, because it was an education, like you said, a bit similar to Swarthmore. I went to Gettysburg, and it didn't really prepare me at all. And it was those men and women that I've met in those 9 years who really taught me a lot. And so I guess for those people who think that this is too soft on crime, or too soft on people who've done serious harm and serious violence, what is the cost of not seeing them as people like you and I? What does the community lose?
Oh, I think there's
Thanks, Kyla. I think we've lost David. We're going to hold on and see if we can't get David back with us. Those of you who have questions or comments, I'm going to ask that you feel free to put them into the chat. We'll take a few of those before we're done here. Mark, maybe we could have Mark come up and talk a little bit about his time in Chester. Mark, would you be willing?
Sure, be happy to do that. I'm not sure I could do the experience justice as David Kennedy has done. It is a community that was prospering for many, many years. Economically, in many ways, has now a rich history that saw what many parts of the country saw, with industry leaving and many things changing, and the population slowly declining, but those who remain in a really challenging space, and high crime rates for a very long time, particularly violent crime. And the library also had a long history in the community, and I think the library was well positioned to attempt to foster some conversations, potentially some initiatives, but also to encourage some change in the community. And David Kennedy accepted our invitation to visit and to speak. He led multiple conversations. He met with the city council during his visit to talk about the model that he developed and to offer to work with the city. And so committed himself to supporting the change that was needed, and never really backed away from that commitment. I mean, continued to make himself available. And I think the commitment that often means that it takes years for things in some cases to be adopted, but then the change starts to happen. And to actually see the data now is tremendous. To actually see the change is really gratifying, is the wrong word, but it just means people are living a life where they're safer.
So how did you come about learning about David and his book? I mean, you are the one who I've seen this book before. When I was in the jail, actually, one of the guys said, "Miss Lau, you need to read this," and I put it on my pile, and it kind of just sat there. But how did you come across David?
I think it was quite interesting. I had worked at Widener University prior to moving to the public library, and a colleague in the English department recommended the book, and she also suggested we might collaborate, and that collaboration led to the invitation.
David, we're glad you're back. Would you like to try to answer that question, or do you want to keep going?
No, I'm sorry about that. I have no idea what happened there, but here we are. So I was being pretty long-winded here. So let me take another crack at this. So I know you have done work in prison lockup,
Mm-hmm.
and you have found that important and valuable. And what I'm going to take that to mean is that you resonated, you could have a relationship with at least some of the people who are locked up there. That's been my experience too. I can't tell you how many gang members and drug dealers I have met and spent time with, sometimes very intensely, sometimes over long periods. I've liked almost all of them. I've done a lot of work with domestic abusers too, and my experience is that I do not like them. Right, so it's not that we're wrong, that there are bad things, and that people who do them can be different. They absolutely can be. But if we go back to where I started about the nature of the violence and what works against it, one of the core facts there is that violence, the kind of violence we're talking about, is about groups, gangs, drug crews, other kinds of groups, but it's not really about individuals. Of course it is, but it's also about groups and group dynamics. And groups and group dynamics are really different than just kind of an addition and division of individual character. And groups, we all know this, groups of people will do awful things. And they're awful things that are really fundamentally different than what individuals do. And they happen in ways that are really different than what individuals do. So, there are places in this country that if you happen to grow up as a young man on a particular street, young men on another street think you're their enemy. And they won't know why, they won't know what started it. Whatever it is that began that beef is lost in history. Nobody who's around then is around anymore. But the beef is real. And the violence that it produces is real, and the defensive actions that people take are real. And those defensive actions will include having somebody to watch your back and getting weapons, at which point you're a gang. And very likely that you're going to do things that get you locked up, and not at all unlikely that you will in fact get locked up. And the terrible acts are real, and the terrible consequences are real, but it's often not entirely right to look at those and then say, as you know, it's so natural to do, those are terrible people. That last step is more complicated than often we think it is. And you are a woman, and I like saying this to women because they really get it. This is a group thing. This is violence is a young man's game. You know, mostly by the time you're in your late 20s, everybody has gotten smarter and aged out of this kind of thing. So this is really an issue of groups of young men. And what every woman knows is that there's a stupider organism on the planet than an adolescent male with their friends watching, right? But that doesn't make them terrible people. Certainly not always.
I often found that they made weapons because they were afraid.
Yeah.
They brought them into the library because they were afraid. And after a particularly kind of horrific incident with a 13.5-inch plumbing screw, I got a note saying that wasn't for you. That wasn't, we knew the unit was going to get locked down, and when violence happened in the units, when I walked in, various days, Miss Lau, we'll watch your back. You get out. Make sure you get in the side port. We'll watch your back. When I showed up with books, they were right there. And when I asked, like, why are you back here? What are you doing here? They always said, oh, Miss Lau, you don't understand. And I didn't understand for a very long time. And then I read your book. And I almost wish I could go back to some of these guys and say, you're right, I should have read your book. I should have read your book a long time ago. Because knowing that we're both afraid of each other, kind of, it humanizes the whole situation. And I tell people all the time that these kids are I used to teach the kids same age at the University of Mississippi. Then I came and still spent some time teaching, different things about law and things, but the same kids and very similar situations, but the neighborhoods were so different.
Yeah.
That climate was different.
There's an extraordinarily gifted Los Angeles police officer named Phil Tingerides, who has done some of the most groundbreaking violence prevention work anywhere, but in Los Angeles and in South Central LA, where forever violence in LA has been concentrated. It's Crip and blood and very traditional gang turf. The public housing projects in LA, Nickerson Gardens and Jordan Downs and those places were for a long time the most dangerous places in the United States. And they're not anymore. And that's because of a different kind of police community partnership, but involving the same sorts of people that we've been talking about. And the last time I went to Nickerson Gardens with Phil, I went back to my hotel room and cried, because I had known it when it was indescribably awful. And now you'd be happy to live there. And the change that has been brought is almost literally incredible. And that was done in partnership with LAPD officers and gang members and former gang members. To your point, nobody likes living like this. And some little while back, an LAPD officer went rogue, and he felt that he had beef with his peer officers in LAPD, and he was killing them. He went on a sniping rampage across LA, armed, if I recall correctly, with a .50 caliber Barrett military sniper rifle, which is about as heavy ordnance as you can have without a Jeep or a tracked vehicle to carry it. And Phil Tingerides was on his to-do list. And gang members in Watts organized themselves to stand guard around Phil and his family's house and protect him, because that was the kind of relationship that they built. It is almost unbelievable, except that it's not.
Yeah, I will never ever vote and act the same as a result of meeting those people. I've forever changed, but I will say that a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD did nothing to introduce me to that world. I had to go on the ground, and I think that's one of the things that really struck me about this book in particular was that you're willing to do the work. And there were a lot of people I've met over the years who aren't willing to get down and get in the trenches. To spend the time to do the work, to have the conversations, to be afraid, to be upset, to be horrified, to be all of those things. But at the end of the day, you end your book so well, it's time to do the work. And I just, it's like, where do I sign up? How do we sign up? How do we get our library? How do we get everybody, because we should be upset about have people having to live this way. We should be upset about every time we lose a young person. And sometimes I wonder where the outrage is. Is it we're used to it? Are we immune to it? I mean, I think you said in your book, it's equivalent of like September 11th every year, the number of young men who've died.
Young Black men.
Yes.
That's correct. I'm a little bit more optimistic about why we're not outraged. I think we are outraged. I think people just don't know what to do. And there have been all kinds of prescriptions, looking back as long as we can imagine, and they all fall into two camps. There's on crime, law enforcement community, and a set of prescriptions that comes from that direction. There's a root cause prevention community, and a lot of prescriptions that come from that direction. And none of them have worked. People know that. People know that this problem has been with us forever. They know that people have been saying and trying the same thing about it forever, and they know that it hasn't worked. I really don't think that people don't care as much as they quite properly don't think that the people who are saying they can handle it, and that it will make any difference. Our experience is that when you offer people something that makes sense to them, it's much easier to get action. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
And this approach doesn't cost a lot of money, does it? I mean, comparatively to what we've thrown at other things?
It absolutely doesn't. It takes commitment and it takes leadership. And those are commodities that are in very short supply. And not just about this, but about anything that matters. We could all wish for more seriousness from our society about the importance. But that can be had, and that can be created. That's the most important resource. Again, the operational elements here are law enforcement and community and social services. And as stretched as all of those sectors can be, for one of the most important issues that any of them face, they can find some resources. And these days, because of the credibility that this portfolio has built over the decades, the federal government is in the game for the first time. One of the places that we have not had seriousness on this is from the federal government. And Washington has never made what we're talking about a priority, to the extent that Washington has committed resources to this. It's been almost entirely through law enforcement. Law enforcement cannot do this on its own. A lot of those law enforcement strategies have been not only ineffective, but they've been actively harmful in the way that they have brought the thunder and lightning down on the communities that are already suffering from the violence and the ripple effects from the violence. That's changed in just the last couple of years, and there are now hundreds of millions of dollars available through the federal government for this kind of violence prevention, and that makes everything a lot easier.
I think one of the most moving parts of your book is when you have the gentleman who apologizes for letting down the community, and saying that essentially what we know and what we've seen, even following, police in this community are very, among my guys, they could say anything nice to save their lives. How do we get to the point of this apology, of being able to talk to the community about wanting their trust, about wanting them to call, but also wanting them to believe? Is that like the hardest thing right now after that post George Floyd era, or is it as bad as we think it is?
Oh, it's been really bad for a very long time. And the fact is, so there's a very, very powerful concept in political theory and in sociology and criminal justice, and we all know it in our daily life. Legitimacy, and in the scholarship, legitimacy is formally understood as the belief by the public that government, and if we're talking about law enforcement, especially police, have the moral standing to say to them as members of the public, don't do this and do that. That as agents of the state, they are acting with the motivation and the effectiveness and the respect that would lead people to do what they say. And your guys did not feel that toward the police, and many, but most of the people in the communities that they come from do not feel that about the police. And that's history. I mean, history can be right up to a moment ago, but that's history. I know without knowing it that most of the men that you met in prison were black and brown. Yep. Because they were. The black and brown experience, as with indigenous peoples here and others, but very particularly the black experience in America, was one of racism and oppression before there was even a United States, right? Their history begins with the slave trade, with transportation, before we were America. And there's the long, awful history of slavery and the gains of the Civil War and Reconstruction being taken away by the Black Codes and separate people and all the rest of it. And just when legally we were climbing out of that in the civil rights era in the 60s and 70s, that's the beginning of the war on drugs and the war on crime and our march toward mass incarceration, which ends up with our being 5% of the world and locking up 25% of all the people in the world are in American jails and prisons. Why should they like that? Right? And one of the things that you find is that there are concentrations of violence only in populations that have a broken relationship with their government. So we're talking about what people now call community violence, which is being hugely disproportionately visited on especially Black communities. But it's also found in Native American communities. We know that story. And it's in queer and trans communities, and we know that story. And it's in immigrant communities, and we know that story. When I do explicit reconciliation work between especially police and communities, and I was talking about what I know best, which is the relationship between Black communities and the police and vice versa. And there was a gay man at the table, and he said, I want to remind you that Stonewall was not just a rejection of policing of gay people by the New York Police Department. It was the moment that the gay men at Stonewall said, we will not let you extort us any longer. And I didn't know any of this. I'm not dumb. And I had never understood this. And it was, I've done my homework since, and he was absolutely right. It was the standard practice of the New York Police Department or officers in the New York Police Department to go into gay clubs in the 50s and 60s and 70s and tell all the men there, turn out your pockets, give us everything you've got, or we will arrest you and ruin your life, which is what an arrest of that kind at that moment, in fact, meant. And the Stonewall Uprising was those men that day saying, not anymore. The role of the government is to step in when, one of them is to step in when social frictions, personal frictions, get to the point that we can't take care of them ourselves. Right? Security is the first obligation of government, whether that's against enemies, foreign or domestic. When the agents of the state that are supposed to provide security are themselves a danger to you and your community, then that entire relationship falls apart. And that lack of legitimacy is one of the root causes of violence. And it's why we find violence in places that do not trust the police and do not trust the government, because then people have to take care of themselves, and then you get beef and retaliation and vendetta. That's what gets us the situation we've got. In practice, it turned out that simply having even some of the police, some of the government, say to the kinds of men that you got to know in prison, we're sorry, we've done wrong, and we're going to be honest about it. That alone makes an amazing difference. And that's enough to create some common ground that you can then build on.
I just, one of the things I promised when I left was that I wouldn't forget them. And your book reminded me of that promise. So I want to thank you for this, because I feel like it is very hopeful. And it's not just hopeful for the guys that I met and the women that I met, but the communities that we live in, the kids that can grow up and become whatever they want to be in a safe place. So it's, I guess my last question to you, since we're almost out of time, is that it's a very real thing for me to have been in that environment for as long as I was and not be affected. It was hard. It's hard. You talk about hard work and having to go in every day and not know what you're going to get. But it's meaningful work. But I guess my question to you is, how do you maintain that inspiration and hope each day? What drives you to do this work each day? What do you do to remind yourself of why when it's so hard? Like, what is the...
I don't have to remind myself. These are awful realities. They are awful issues. As much headway has been made, it's not good enough. It will never be good enough. And the best thing about doing this kind of work is the people that are drawn to it. And they can be from all kinds of different points of origin. They can come to it for all different sorts of reasons. But people who are drawn to this because they get it and they mean it are amazing. And one thing they all have in common is that they just can't imagine giving up. And there's wonderful, as wretched as all this is, there's real community in that.
Thank you so much. I guess I'm going to invite Mark back on to wrap us up.
I can't thank you enough for taking time to lead this conversation. It reflects your commitment to continuing the conversation, raising the level of conversation, and I thank you for allowing us to be involved in hosting. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Audrey, for moderating.
Thank you.
Right back at you. Audrey, Doctor, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.